House Bill 1170 is legislation that will repeal the death penalty that I know at the end of the evening everybody here is going to be running out and contacting people like us, like me, to urge them to support this bill. New Hampshire doesn't love the death penalty. In 1834, Governor William Badger first asked the legislature to repeal capital punishment, and 180 years later, we're in the end game of what was then the anti-gallows movement. We're now the death penalty repeal movement, and hopefully by June, the death penalty will be abolished in this state. There's a lot of reasons why the death penalty is bad public policy, but I think what we've seen recently in the state that gives me encouragement is to see people who have changed their position on capital punishment. The more you learn about it, the more you're going to understand why it's a failure. And when Damien speaks to you tonight, he's going to put a face on it that is going to make you feel energized to fight against it. The quick advertising is going to be that in the back, the New Hampshire Coalition Abolish the Death Penalty wants you to come and visit, and if you're a New Hampshire resident, to please sign up, so that you can help in this journey. And I just a couple of things. I'm going to just tell you, I come to opposition to the death penalty because my father was shotgunned to death in my family home 25 years ago. So when I think about what you do in the aftermath of murder, in the aftermath of homicide, it's not an intellectual exercise, it's part of my life. And I'm one of more people than I care to talk about who have had the unspeakable happen, have had a murder take place in their family, and have come to muddle through things and realize that ritual killing by public employees of the person who took our loved one is not going to do the one thing that we really want, which is to bring our loved one back. But it's just going to actually kind of make things not any better. The death penalty ends up being kind of a distraction from meeting the real needs of victims of crime. It's a distraction from our efforts to try to keep our streets and our communities safer. And so what we've seen recently has been the emergence of voices of victims in opposition to the death penalty. During the last a couple weeks ago, there was a hearing in the legislature on House Bill 1170, and the first couple of people to speak were former attorneys general of the state of New Hampshire, who had presided over, who had been participated in the investigations of hundreds of murders, both of whom had supported the death penalty in the past, and both of whom were now asking the legislature to repeal capital punishment. In New Hampshire, we have one person on death row. We spent over $5 million prosecuting that person, and at the same time, there are 120 other unsolved homicides in the state, for which, up until last July, the state spent zero. That's zero general fund dollars. So for the 120 other families who are waiting for their loved ones' cases to be solved, the death penalty has failed them and is a failure. As the former Attorney General said, it's kind of freakish to think that New Hampshire hasn't executed anyone for 75 years. There's been 1,000 homicides in those 75 years, and yet we somehow have singled out someone almost as though they're going to win the lottery in a macabre way of being set up for execution. New Hampshire can live without the death penalty. Anyway, that's what I have to say, and I just want to introduce Damien and Julie, who are going to speak, tell their stories.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Lorri Davis, and this is Damien Echols. How many of you know about the story of the West Memphis Three? Okay, quite a few, but some of you don't. So I'm going to do a brief background and tell you a little bit about the case, the story behind it, and then I'm going to turn it over to Damien, and he'll tell you more about his experience. In 1993, in a small town in Arkansas called West Memphis. It's right across the river from Memphis, Tennessee. 3 8-year-old boys were found murdered. Their bodies were found in a drainage ditch in a wooded area. And as you can imagine, it was a small town. The community went into a panic, and the local police officers, everything just went berserk, and there was a great deal of pressure on them to find the murderers. It was also it's also in the Bible Belt, so there was a great deal of rumors going around. During that time in 1993, there was a thing in this country called satanic panic, where all these stories were being told, even on TV shows like Oprah and Geraldo, about satanic cults in this country where people were, ritualistic killings were going on, and just insane things like that. But police departments were sending their staff to courses to try to teach them how to find the satanic killers in their communities. And it just so happened that Damien and his friend Jason, who listened to Metallica, who at the time was satanic and dressed in black, and because they were seen as outsiders in that community, and unfortunately another teenager who lived in the same, they all lived in the same trailer park. Another teenager, Jessie Misskelley, he was taken into the police department for questioning. They already had their eye on Damien and Jason. Jessie, who had an IQ hovering somewhere around 68 to 72, was questioned for about 12 hours without a lawyer, without his parents there, and pretty much told the police officers his interrogators what they wanted to hear. After 12 hours of interrogation, about 40 minutes of it were taped, and even those 40 minutes are just off the chart, just nothing made sense. He couldn't get the time of the crime right, he couldn't get anything right about what happened in the murders. But he was able to say that he saw Jason and Damien, and then by the end of his interrogation, he had managed to implicate himself. So all 3 of them were arrested and or tried. Damien got the death penalty, and Jason and Jessie got 3 consecutive life sentences. One of the extraordinary things that was happening at this time, and I should say there was no physical evidence against any of them. There was nothing tying them to the victims. None of them knew the victims. None of them were in the neighborhood. It was all circumstantial evidence. It was all mostly rumors and just hysteria. But an extraordinary thing that was happening at the time was HBO had heard about the murders, and there was a small piece in the New York Times that there was a satanic ritualistic murder that had happened in Arkansas. So they sent a film crew down to make a documentary. Joe Berlinger and Bruce Sinofsky were 2 producers. They managed to get there before the trials and unbelievably got complete access to film the trials, to film the victims' families, and the defendants, the lawyers. And the film that they made was called Paradise Lost. They ended up making 3 films in the process over the next 10 or 15 years. But Paradise Lost came out in 1996. I was living in New York at the time, and I went to see it, probably the second screening at a film festival. And I was immediately, of course, as everyone else was in the room, shocked by what we saw, by the evidence that was brought against the three, by the fact that they were convicted, it's a harrowing story. It's horrible, the murders, I mean, everything. And the system completely failed everyone, the victims families, the convicted, their families, their community, and at the end of the day, it fails all of us. But I'm from the South, and I understood the culture, and there was something about Damien, I just felt compelled to help him. I wanted to help him in some way, and I didn't know what to do. So I just decided I would write to him and see what I could do to help. And so we started writing to each other, and 2 years later I moved to Arkansas. Now, I have the slightest idea what I was doing. I'm a landscape architect by training. I don't know anything about law, but his appeals process was starting, and I knew that something had to be done because no one was really working on his case. But there were other people. By this time, other people were starting to see documentaries. So it didn't take long for people to figure out that we all needed to do something. We needed to raise funds. We needed to hire a legal team. We needed to figure out some kind of a strategy. In 1999, we were married, and then it was official that I somehow was supposed to lead this charge. Something I didn't know what I was doing. But by that time, we had gotten a lot of attention. We were very fortunate in that people with a lot of resources contacted us. Eddie Vedder from Pearl Jam, Johnny Depp. By 2005, Fran Walsh and Peter Jackson, who had produced and directed the Lord of the Rings films. We had a lot of help, and then the story started going global, and people would send us money from all over the world, and we had a defense fund set up, and then we started the PR machine because media is so important in these cases, and in this fight to abolish the death penalty, to humanize it and to get people to understand how wrong it is. And so it was a long time. It took a long time. So by 2011, well, actually, just back up a little bit, we won a decision after so many appeals. We just kept appeal after appeal after appeal getting turned down, and it was heartbreaking. But in 2010, the Supreme Court of Arkansas finally ruled for a new hearing in Damien's case, and also in Jessie's and Jason's, which we were all completely dumbfounded, but of course thrilled. And I have to say that it was the work of so many people from around the world who sent us funds. We probably had, 14 lawyers working on the case, countless investigators and experts in all of the fields of forensic science. It's just endless, the amount of help we had, and what it came down to is it doesn't take much to convict someone or to put someone on death row. It takes 2 weeks and not really that much of the state's funding. But to get a conviction overturned, I think it ended up, we probably raised anywhere from $7 to $8 million to get Damien out of prison. It's everything about it is it's just insanity. But I'm going to turn it over to Damien so he can tell you about his experience, and at the end of it, we'll answer your questions if you have any.
When I first arrived on death row, the guards decided they were going to welcome me to the neighborhood. They took me to a part of the prison they call the hole. It's in complete isolation from the rest of the prison, where they can do anything they want to do to you. It's dark, it's incredibly filthy, it's rat infested. During the summer, it can get up to 120 degrees in there sometimes. And for the next 18 days, they beat the living hell out of me. They used to come into my cell at midnight or 1 o'clock in the morning, chain me to the bars of the cell, take turns beating me, sometimes several of them at a time. One time they beat me with nightsticks so bad that I started to piss blood. The only reason they didn't kill me was because other prisoners started to find out what they were doing. Sometimes the sewage would back up, and you'd find yourself for 2 days at a time standing in ankle-deep raw sewage. And whenever that would happen, they would bring prisoners in to clean it up. So they were the ones who saw what was being done to me. They went to a deacon from the Catholic Church who used to come to the prison. He used to come and bring communion to Catholic inmates who were on death row. And they told this guy what they had seen. So this deacon goes to the warden and he tells him, I know what you're doing. I know you're killing this guy. And if it doesn't stop, I'm going to start telling people about it. I'm going to go public with it. Well, that night, they took me out of the hole and put me back in a regular cell on death row. The only reason that they did not kill me, that they did not torture me to death, was because they realized the outside world was paying attention to them, that someone was seeing what they were doing. Not for that, they would have killed me. When I was a kid, growing up in Arkansas, my family lived in a state of poverty that goes beyond being poor. You know, we lived in such poverty that most people in the United States probably think in this day and age it only exists in third world countries. There were times when we didn't have running water or electricity or anything else. We had to burn stuff just to stay warm. I started reading a lot at that age. I fell in love with books just because they were the only escape I had from that environment, from that situation, even if it was only for a little while. We couldn't actually afford books, so I used to go to the public library. I'd spend hours every day just devouring stories. At a really young age, I fell in love with Stephen King books. I probably read the first one when I was 10 or 11 years old, and it was my grandmother's. She thought that was appropriate childhood reading. I didn't have many friends. Actually, I didn't have any friends at all, except for a skinny blonde kid with a mullet named Jason. And Jason was with me the night I was arrested. We were sitting in my living room, me and Jason, my sister, and my girlfriend at the time, whenever the cops started beating on the door. They were hammering on it like they wanted to knock it off the hinges. When I opened it, it looked like pretty much every cop in West Memphis was standing there with their guns pointed at me. They arrested me and Jason both, handcuffed us, threw us in the backs of cop cars, and drove us to the jail. When we got there, they put me in a cell that was barely bigger than a phone booth. No bathroom, nowhere to even get so much as a drink of water. It was so small you couldn't even lay down, you just had to stand there. They left me there all night. Every so often, one of the cops would come in and ask me if I was ready to make my confession yet. They told me that someone else had already confessed and that they had put most of the blame on me. So that if I wanted to save myself, then I should confess and point the finger at this person. I had no idea who the hell they were even talking about at first. You know, I only had one friend and he was arrested with me. This went on all night long until the next morning when they took me out of the cell and before a judge for an arraignment hearing. At this arraignment hearing, I was told that I'm being charged with 3 counts of capital murder. That I'm being accused of killing 3 children as a human sacrifice. The judge said they had a confession, but they refused to read it out loud in the courtroom. Instead, they took me behind the judge's chambers into a broom closet. And they put me in this broom closet with a typed transcript, this so-called confession. Told me I could read it. You know, you have to keep in mind I was barely more than a kid myself. I was a teenager. I was sleep deprived. I was in a severe state of shock and trauma. I had my entire world ripped apart, my entire life destroyed. But even in that state, I could read these pages and see that they made no sense whatsoever. It looked like some sort of weird Frankenstein thing that they had stitched together. Turns out that what they had done was pick up a mentally handicapped kid from my neighborhood, and over a period of somewhere between 12 to 14 hours had tortured a confession out of him. Couldn't actually get any of the details right because he wasn't at the crime scene. He didn't know anything about it. But that didn't matter to them. The only thing that mattered to them was the fact that they had gotten him to say yes. They got him to say yes and to point the finger at me. I was left in a cell after that for most of the next year while I waited to go to trial. And then when I did go to trial, the evidence that they presented against me were things like the Stephen King books that I had loved when I was a kid. The fact that I owned heavy metal albums, posters that had been hanging on my walls. They said all of these things were proof that I was a Satanist. Prosecutor actually stood in court and said all of these things prove that I had no soul. By that point, by the time we walked into the courtroom, the local media had stirred everyone in the area up into such a frenzy. You know, every single day there were these stories, these big headlines about satanic orgies and human sacrifices. So that by the time we did walk into the courtroom, the jury looked at the trial as nothing more than a formality that they had to go through in order to sentence me to death. And that's what they did. They sentenced me to death 3 times. They sentenced me to die over and over and over. People who've seen the footage, the courtroom footage of it happening, they always say I seem so calm. And ask me what I was thinking, what was going through my mind. The only thing I could compare it to is if you've ever been beaten. You know, when you're punched in the head, it doesn't always immediately register as pain. Sometimes you just see a bright flash of light and you hear a loud noise. You're really disoriented. You can barely keep your feet up under you. That's what it was like listening to this judge read off these death sentences in this bored, monotone, just another day at the office for me voice. It was like being beaten in the head repeatedly. They took me straight from the courtroom to a cell on death row. I was in such a deep state of shock and trauma that I was sick for probably the first 3 weeks. Really sick. I was so sick that at first I didn't even notice that the guy who had been in the cell before me had stood against one of the walls, taken a pencil, traced really lightly around himself. Like made a silhouette of himself on the wall, but he had done it really, really light, really subtle, so you barely saw it. I have no idea why. It was so subtle that at first I didn't even see it, but then whenever I did finally see it, when I finally noticed it, I couldn't stop staring at it. I couldn't unsee it. I couldn't make myself wash it off or erase it, because I knew this was the last thing in the world left of this man that they'd killed. So I lived in a dead man's cell and slept on a dead man's mattress. Lived there for over 18 years. 18 years and 76 days. I didn't want to waste my time while I was there. There's no growth in prison. There's no momentum, no development. You know, I was there for almost 20 years and I never saw even the slightest trace of anything that could even be remotely considered a rehabilitation program or an educational system or anything else. So I knew that if I didn't want to stagnate, to start to rot inside the way everyone else in there was doing, that I was going to have to do something myself. It led me on various ventures through the years. It was one of the things that made me start practicing meditation. I had a Zen master that would come all the way from Japan to the prison in Arkansas. And eventually, as the years passed, I received ordination in the Rinzai Zen tradition of Japanese Buddhism. It was the same tradition that used to train the samurai in ancient Japan. That was one of the huge things that got me through those days. As year after year went by, my attorneys would file appeal after appeal on my behalf. Every single one of which was shot down by the same judge who had sentenced me to death. Even when we came up with new evidence, when they tested the DNA at the crime scene and found that not only did it didn't match me or the other 2 men they had convicted, but instead it matched one of the victim's stepfathers and the man who had been providing the stepfather with an alibi, the judge still said it doesn't matter. Even when 3 eyewitnesses came forth and said they had seen the same man the DNA matched with all 3 victims within an hour of the time they were murdered, said it didn't matter. This case is closed. It's over. He was determined that they were going to kill me one way or another. Fortunately, by that time we were finally able to appeal the case to the Arkansas Supreme Court. And by that time there had been documentaries and books and magazine articles, TV shows about the case. People had put together websites to try to spread awareness of what was happening. People were doing anything they could to try to raise money to pay for legal fees, everything from putting on benefit concerts to holding bake sales. So the Arkansas Supreme Court realized that they were being watched, and that was the only thing they cared about. Like that someone was paying attention to what they were doing. So they ruled that there was going to be a new hearing. And that finally, after 18 years, all of the evidence, the DNA evidence, the eyewitnesses, everything else that the prosecution had tried so hard to keep covered up, that it was finally going to be heard. The prosecutor knew this meant there was going to be a new trial. And he knew there was no way in hell they were going to win that trial. So he got together with my attorneys and they hammered out a deal. It's called an Alford plea. I mean, in essence, what the prosecutor told my attorneys is, yes, when we go back to court, you'll win this case. We can drag it out another 5 years. We can drag it out another 10 years. Every time a date is set, we can ask for an extension. Every time a decision is made, we can appeal it. Or you can sign these papers and go home before the week is out. So I took the deal. I signed the papers. People ask me now, did I have to wrestle with that or come to terms with it in some sort of way? The answer is no. I was dying in there. I was losing my eyesight. At one point, right now, I weigh about 175 pounds. At one point, I was down to 116. There's almost no medical care, dental care, anything like that in prison. Especially on death row. They're not going to spend a lot of time and money and energy taking care of someone they plan on killing. I also knew Lorri and I produced a documentary called West of Memphis. And in this documentary, the prosecutor actually agreed to do an interview. And in his interview, he said his number one priority for making this deal was the fact that me, Jason, and Jessie could have collectively sued the state of Arkansas for $60 million. And it was his job to make sure that didn't happen. He said this. I also knew that these people could have me stabbed to death for a pack of cigarettes, $50, any day of the week. Happens in prison all the time and nobody ever even thinks twice about it. I knew one way or the other, whether it was my own failing health or whether it was violence or whatever it was, I knew that if I didn't take that deal, I was never going to live to see the outside of those walls again. So I took the deal, and after 18 years and 76 days, I walked off of death row. People think whenever you come out, you're just going to be happy and excited that you're out of prison, that you're back in the world. And you are. But at the same time, you are broken into a million pieces inside. You're so fucked up in every way possible that you don't know if you're ever going to be put back together again. I've been out for about 2.5 years now. And still not anywhere near completely better. You know, I've talked to people who were in for almost as long as I was and asked them how long did it take before you even started to feel normal again after you got out. He said about 5 years. But you don't get used to being in prison in a single day. And you don't get used to being out of prison in a single day. When I first got out, I was absolutely terrified of everything. You know, I'd been in prison for almost 20 years. When I went into prison, when I got out of prison in 2011, the last time I had seen a computer was 1986. And it was basically a giant glorified typewriter for rich people. It wasn't connected to the internet or anything else. Cell phones were these giant brick-looking things that very, very few people had. The technology was frightening, was intimidating. But even more than that, not only had I been in prison for 18 years, I'd been in solitary confinement for almost the last 10 of that. So just human interaction alone, to say that it was overwhelming doesn't even come close to describing it. I've worked through a lot of it in 2.5 years. But I still have a long, long way to go. I do believe that eventually I will fight my way through all of the fear and the trauma and everything else and have a normal life again. Because if there's one thing you learn in prison, it's how to fight your way through things. Just want to say thank you guys for wanting us here, having us here, and for listening. And with the remainder of the time that we have, we want to open this up to talk about whatever it is you want to talk about. Whether it's criminal justice system, whether it's prison, whether it's the death penalty, whether it's the case, whatever it is, that's why we're here. We're here to talk about whatever is of interest to you. So we're just going to open up the floor to anyone who has questions.
Testing, testing.
I just want to say thank you for coming and sharing your story. But I guess my first question is, how has being out of prison impacted your relationship with your wife, if at all?
I think when we were in there, the thing I always compare it to having a relationship in prison is almost like someone who suffered brain damage. A lot of times when someone has some sort of traumatic event that causes brain damage, the brain is forced to form connections that it wouldn't otherwise form in order to compensate for the damaged areas. And that's sort of what we had to do in prison. We didn't have the things to rely on that most people have. We couldn't go to dinner together or sleep in the same bed at night or go watch movies together. So we had to come up with other things. Things like practicing meditation at the exact same time every day. There were times also For those who've read the book, I talked about something in it that we called moon water, where on nights of the full moon we would fill a glass up with water and put it in the window ledge so that the moon would shine on it. And then we would keep that glass, and every single night, at the same time, every night, we would both take a drink from the glass and know that in that moment we were together. In that moment we were both doing the same thing at the same time. We had to forge all sorts of mental and emotional connections that most people don't have to. So whenever I did get out and we were together, I guess it was just almost like adding something extra to it. You know, we had already been connected. We had already been together on all of these other levels for so long that whenever we were together physically, it almost felt like it wasn't anything new. It almost felt like just a slight extension of what we had already been doing all along. There are still things to work through, you know, little weird things like, when I first got out, you know, I've always loved horror movies my entire life. The very first movie I can remember going to, I was probably 6 years old, and I was still so small. It was a drive-in movie theater, and I was still so small that I could stand up in the back seat of the car without hitting my head on the roof. And my mom and dad took me to see the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Yeah. So I guess for me, I always equated, you know, these horror movies with a sense of security, with a sense of comfort, with a sense of family in a way. They didn't scare me. So I got out of prison and I found these channels on TV that show all horror movies 24 hours a day. And I would turn them on at night and leave the TV on 24 hours a day and just go to sleep. You know, to me, like I said, it was a sense of comfort. And then finally, after about 2 weeks, Lorri says, I cannot do this anymore. I cannot fall asleep to the sound of people screaming every night. So there's stuff like that to work through.
I want to speak to this a little bit. It's a very good question. It's a very complicated answer. One of the things, and in this age of deployment and people coming back from war, and the thing everyone knows as PTSD, and it affects so many people in a lot of different ways. And that's one of the things that I wasn't prepared for when Damien got out, and how he was suffering, and how I could deal with it, or what I could do for him, or even how we could live through it. And it took about 6 months. I mean, I knew he was suffering, and I knew he was struggling, and we had been put into, not only had we been living through tremendous stress when we were working on his case, and it was just a constant, it was a struggle, it was hard, and then suddenly he's released, and it came so quickly. Literally, I was called on a Saturday morning and told he was going to be released in a matter of days. So we didn't have time to prepare where we were going to live, what we were going to do. You know, it was not the way we thought it was going to go, but of course we were happy about it. But we ended up, you know, homeless and pretty much with a suitcase. And but like I said before, we were pretty fortunate. We had some really good friends, and so we were given a place to live for a year. And we were living in Manhattan, and Damien is completely struggling, trying to find his way just down the street, or how to go to the grocery store, things that we all take for granted. And it really was about 6 months in that he finally was able to describe to me what his days were like every day. And each day from the moment he woke up was just one episode of fear after another. The kind of thing where he described it as, you know, driving down the road and hitting ice and knowing that your car is going to go over the rail. You're just headed toward the guardrail, you know you're going to go off, and then suddenly your tires hit pavement again, and then that feeling of adrenaline. Well, he was living that pretty much every 5 minutes. And at that moment I realized that my role as his wife had to be his protector for a while until he could, that was what I wasn't prepared for, because Damien was extraordinary when he was in prison. He owned his life as best as anyone could in those circumstances. So I wasn't used to this new person that wasn't ruling his world or wasn't so completely sure of what he was doing and how to live. And so I had to become this person, and it's not really me. I'm not aggressive in that way, and I'm not forthright, but I had to become the person who was saying, no, he can't do this, he can't do that, even though we were put on pretty much a world tour to promote our film and our books and all of the things that we had to do to make a living. But now it's kind of changing. He's starting to take control of his world, so I'm looking real forward to taking the back seat, probably for the rest of my life. Thank you for that question.
Hi, I have kind of like two questions that follow with it. But with the Alfred plea, when I watched the documentary, so you had to say you were guilty to this crime. Was that what the Alfred plea is about? I wasn't really sure.
The Alfred plea, I had never even heard of this before they came to me with it. It was something that made absolutely no sense whatsoever. What an Alfred plea means is that you maintain your innocence, but you accept the guilty plea that they're offering at the same time. In essence, what it is a way for the state to not be held accountable for what they've done. Because they can say, yes, he still says he's innocent, but look, we have his signature on this piece of paper that says otherwise. To this day, no one has ever been exonerated in the state of Arkansas. The state of Arkansas, the Attorney General still maintains in the briefs he files that the state of Arkansas has never so much as sent an innocent person to prison, much less executed one.
So for the man who did commit these crimes, what happened to him? Absolutely nothing, or?
Absolutely nothing. He's still out there wandering around doing God knows what.
Thank you. I kind of have like a 2-in-1 question as well. But my first question is, being in prison for 18 years, I know you said there was like a lot of coping mechanisms that you use, but besides the meditation, what is it that you did to keep your mind, and also did you have somebody in there that you could confide in, or was it more of just an internal battle?
You don't really make friends in prison. I learned that whenever I first got there. I'd say probably the first 2, maybe 3 years that I was there, I kept waiting for someone to come through the door that you could have a normal conversation with, and it never happened. And what I eventually came to realize is that's because normal people don't kill people. So the best thing that you're going to have, best possible scenario, is that you find someone that you have an understanding with, that you may not even get along on every level, but you have the understanding that I've got your back and you've got my back no matter what. We might not even agree, but whatever happens, we're going to watch each other's backs. That's the closest thing to a friend that you ever make in prison. And I had someone like that. He's still there now. He'll probably be executed sometime this year. The coping mechanisms, there's no time in there. There's, noon is the same as midnight. Christmas is the same as the 4th of July. It's all the same. So you have to establish some sort of routine to create time for yourself. People who don't go insane. They go stark raving insane. And I mean literally insane. I've seen people snap. I saw one guy snap and just start punching the walls until both his fists were just bloody and wrecked. And he was screaming that the devil was in his cell. And they take him out and bandage his hands up and throw him right back in. So you have to do something to keep yourself motivated and occupied. And for me, a lot of that was working out. It was reading. I only have a ninth grade education. I dropped out of school when I was in ninth grade. And that's more than anyone else in my family has. If you look back through our family tree, I doubt you would ever find anyone that ever had a high school diploma. But I decided I wanted to have the same frame of reference that everyone else had. You know, it's like Lorri, she had traveled the world, she had been to college. And I wanted to know the things that people in that world knew. So I set about this task of several years of trying to educate myself. And I read, there was no rhyme or reason to anything I read. I would just plow through things, like everything by Camus and Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Dickens. I would just plow through all of it, one after another, and then I would switch over for a while and start reading, you know, military history, everything from the Peloponnesian Wars to the American Civil War. And then I would switch over and start reading psychology textbooks or the writings of Freud. And after several years, what I realized was I've read a bunch of crap. It didn't feed me, it didn't nurture me, it didn't give me what I felt like I needed, which is when I went right back to reading the Stephen King novels. I also, after I was there, you know, my eyes started getting worse and worse. So I started to think of reading as almost like spending money. You know, you have to be very conscious, very aware of what you're going to spend it on. So I started reading only things. The last probably 5 years that I was in prison, I only read books on meditation, energy work, things like that. Like I said, there was no real medical care, and at one point I had a lot of nerve damage in my teeth from being hit in the face. And in prison there are no caps, no crowns, no root canals, none of that. Your choices are live in pain or let them pull your teeth out. And I didn't want them to pull my teeth out. So I had to find some way to cope with the pain. And that's what led me to spend, by the time I got out, I was spending up to 7 hours a day doing meditation, doing energy work, a lot of, Tai Chi, Qigong, Taoist energy circulation exercises, all that sort of stuff. And that was all I was reading by the time I got out. Really, when you're in there, your coping mechanisms, what it comes down to is how much do you want to keep living? If you want to keep living, you'll find a way to deal with it. But the vast majority of people eventually over time end up giving up.
And then just one more question. Obviously, they took away half your life. Is there any type of compensation you received, or how did they repay you for what you lost?
They did not. I did not receive one single penny, anything from them. When I walked out of prison, I did not have one single penny in my pocket. I did not have so much as a suit of clothes to change into. I had nowhere to go. I was homeless. If it wasn't for people reaching out and catching us and helping us in all sorts of different ways, I have no idea what we would have done. No idea whatsoever. You know, a lot of it though, we gained also a lot out of it. Not monetarily, but like in relationships and experiences and things like that. We met people who started off as supporters and became closer to me than my own flesh and blood family is. People that we wouldn't trade for anything in the world, and that we wouldn't have known had we not had to go through all this. So in a way, that's compensation. But the state itself, they did or gave us absolutely nothing to help in any sort of way at all.
I'm really bad at forming questions, so forgive me if it sounds really ridiculous. I get really, really upset over things like this, and I might start crying, and I'm also apologizing about that too. I care so much about the industrial prison complex, or prison industrial complex, and what it does to our society. And I'm just wondering, what do you tell people to not get so depressed about shit like this. Like, it makes me go insane. I have so much empathy and so much anger. When shit like this happens, it drives me insane. And I have a family background where it's just, like, my father's an African-American man and has just been in and out of, like, jail, and my mother's been in and out of jail, and it's just, like, it's so hard to make people see that it's not the individual, it's the structure of our society that's fucking people over. And I don't know how to make people see that, and I don't know how to not get so angry that I cry about it. And I guess I'm just wondering, like, what advice do you give to people who hear things like this and get so upset and angry and don't know how to work through that or how to manifest that in their life?
I guess the number one thing, and it's really hard whenever you're that passionate about something, but the number one thing is you can't preach at people because nobody wants to hear that. As soon as you start, they'll shut off, they'll block it out. What you have to do is appeal to their sense of reason. You know, the thing that I always try to get across to people is almost every single person in prison will be back out on the streets one day. The number of people who are actually going to be executed or the number of people who spend their entire lives in prison is a tiny, tiny fraction of the prison population. Almost every single person in there is going to be back out. They're going to be living in your neighborhood. They're going to be going to your churches, your schools. They're going to be shopping at the same grocery store as you are. So it's probably not the best idea to drive them stark raving mad before bringing them back out into that world. I think what it comes down to, the only thing that's going to change things, you have to get rid of this us versus them mentality. Because whenever you do things like the way things are being run right now, in the end, you end up hurting yourself because those people are going to be part of the world again. It would make more sense to actually spend some time, some energy, some effort into doing some sort of real rehabilitation instead of just giving lip service to it. But really in the United States, what it comes down to, the system is based on money. What's going to get them more money, how they can make more money. They get money for every single person that's in prison. Most people, they don't care yet. So as to how to get them to care, I don't know. I guess really what it comes down to is education. You know, right now, you may feel powerless in some ways to do anything. And I used to feel that way too. But you have to keep in mind, this is the thing that Lorri and I keep in mind. Every single person that hears us speak, every single person that reads my book, every single person that watches the documentaries is a potential jury member on someone else's trial in the future and can make sure the same thing doesn't happen to someone else. So even if it doesn't seem like a difference is being made sometimes, it is. It's just happening behind the scenes in a way that's hard to be aware of. And that's what you have to keep in mind. That's what keeps the anger away.
Thank you.
When you were in prison for that long, was there any way for you to keep up with the outside world at all, or was it just a major culture shock when you finally were released?
It was a huge culture shock. In prison, you know, there's not even things like people out here believe there are, like cable TV or stuff. There's none of that. So, you know, it would have been a culture shock. I grew up my entire life in the South. I grew up in Arkansas and Mississippi and Louisiana. So just coming from that, when I first got out, we moved to the heart of Manhattan, New York City. So even just going from a normal life in the South to that would have been a huge culture shock. But then you take into consideration, you know, prison and 10 years in solitary confinement. I still, to this day, have no idea how to articulate it to people, what it was I was experiencing, what it was I was going through, trying to take it all in. When we first went to New York, I looked looked around at everything around me, and I used to go out and I would walk almost 24 hours a day. You know, I think in a way, being in solitary confinement for that long, it sort of starves you for human contact. So I would go out into the busiest streets I could find, like the heart of Chinatown, and I would just wander around with no particular destination in mind, just sort of letting that river of humanity flow over me. And I looked at everything there, and I thought, in the 20 years that I was in prison, every single thing in the world changed. Nothing is the same as it was when I went in. People now are educated, and they're not as hateful and spiteful. They're not rednecks anymore. And then we went back to visit Lorri's family in West Virginia. And I looked around and I thought, my God, nothing has changed in 20 years. It was like the exact same place I had left behind on the day they sent me to prison. So I think the culture shock, it varies from place to place, wherever you go at the same time. But it's still, you know, to this day, I'm still trying to get over it, trying to get through it, trying to work my way through things. You know, I'd lived in a box for almost 20 years. So just finding my way from point A to point B was a huge challenge. You know, you get out and you have a doctor's appointment and you have to figure out how to make your way to that. It was something I hadn't dealt with in almost 20 years. So I started doing things lately. You know, I guess what it came down to, one time we went to this thing in New York called Sleep No More. And it's a 5-story warehouse. And you're in this thing with 200, maybe 300 other people, and everyone is wearing a mask. Think of something along the lines of that movie, Eyes Wide Shut. That's what it's like. I mean, you may walk into one room in this warehouse, and it's like you've actually walked into a cemetery. There's dirt on the floor, and there are gravestones, and there's fog, and it smells like earth in there. And then you walk into another room, and it's like you've walked into an insane asylum. There are old beds lining the walls and bathtubs in the middle of the floor. You walk into another room, and it's in the middle of New York City, like you walked into this forest in the middle of winter. There are all these trees with no leaves on them. And the light is very, very dark blue. And then you walk into another room, and there's an orgy taking place right in the middle of the floor. We went to this thing, to Sleep No More. And we didn't know when we went in that if they know you're with someone else, they split you off. They split you up. Because they say this is supposed to be an individual experience. This is something that's supposed to change you in some sort of way. When you walk out of this place, you're not supposed to be the same person you were when you walked in. And of course they saw that Lorri and I were together, so they split us up. And they dropped me off on this floor where all of this stuff is going on. And my first instinct was absolute panic, terror. It's the first time I had been by myself since I had been out of prison. And I was in the middle of this crazy house. And my first instinct, of course, was to do everything I could to find Lorri, to just start running through the place looking for her. And I realized that if I didn't find some way to deal with this panic, this terror, that I was never going to be normal again. I was never going to be whole again. I was going to need people to hold my hand for the rest of my life, no matter what I did. So I stopped and made myself go through the place, go through the experience very slowly. Even as scared as I was, I made myself go through it by myself, alone. And that was the beginning of the healing process for me, I think. It still goes on to this day, you know. Still to this day, I'll get on the subway sometimes and just go over to the middle of Brooklyn somewhere, and I'll have no idea where the hell I even am. And I'll just get off and start wandering around because it induces that panic, that terror. I know the only way I'm ever going to get rid of it is to make myself go through it, make myself face it. to make myself face the things that scare me. It's like if you do it one time, then it loses its hold on you, it loses its power on you. And everything else in the world becomes a little less scary and a little less scary. But the shock of things like that is something that I'm still, 2.5 years later, working on to this day.
Thank you.
Hi. So I'm wondering about your transition from prison into the real world and how it was you spent like 10 years in solitary confinement where you kind of made your own schedule and you didn't have the sun or clocks really to dictate your time. And I'm just wondering what that was like to go from a life with virtually no sense of time to now where we check our clocks every second and count the minutes.
It was horrible. One of the things that now, I think anytime I'm sitting in the house, I'm probably staring at my cell phone 23 hours a day. It's almost like you're out here, you're chained to it. You're constantly either checking emails or seeing what the hell's going on Twitter or whatever it is. I even use it now for writing. I write on my phone. So it's so weird being that connected to something that up until recently I had no concept of. Life out here, it's like it never stops moving. In prison, it never moves. Never. Out here, it never stops moving. And a lot of things change. When I got out of prison, I was sitting meditation for anywhere up to 7 hours a day. Out here, a lot of times in the beginning, I was lucky to get in 7 minutes a day. And people didn't comprehend how screwed up I was whenever I got out, so they immediately just threw me into these situations and expected me to be able to deal with them. Like whenever we were promoting the documentary, these are people who are used to dealing with movie stars and actors and things. They're not used to dealing with someone fresh out of prison with extreme post-traumatic stress disorder. So they're expecting me to do things like 20 interviews a day. And I couldn't. I literally started to break down. And then we went to New Zealand when I first got out. Peter Jackson was also one of the producers on the documentary. And I absolutely love him. I love him to death. He's like family. And I always tell people he and his wife both, Fran, they're the two smartest human beings I've ever come across on this earth, period, ever. It's like he sees all of life as a chess game. He can tell you what someone is going to do before they do it. And he'll, make his plans. He'll say, they're going to do this, and when they do, we're going to counter by doing this, and then they're going to do this, and we're going to be ready with this. And every single time, everything unfolds exactly like he says. So he's like a genius. But at the same time, he's like a lunatic. Because when I first got out, he had all these plans that he thought was a great idea. It's like he thinks he's going to make me make up for 18 years of lost time in 2 months. So he starts doing things like one day we took a helicopter into an active volcano where we had lunch. We sat there eating sandwiches and watching the ground boil. And then we went straight from there paragliding. He thought it was a great idea to take a man with extreme post-traumatic stress disorder, strap a parachute on his back and throw him off a cliff. And it wasn't. It was horrible. But at the same time, it was part of what started forcing me into the process of actually coming alive again, of rejoining the world. Still, I'd rather now, though, if I have a choice between things like that and eating cake, I'd rather just stay home and eat cake.
So I'm basically just wondering, what was your mindset as you were going through the multiple appeals you were trying to get? Like, were you hopeful, or was it just something that you sort of had to put out of your mind? Or what were you thinking through all of those?
I lost I completely and absolutely lost faith in the justice system very early on in the process. I guess what I didn't lose faith in was people. You know, the people who were watching, the people who were paying attention, the people who were doing all these things like, putting on the bake sales and making T-shirts and holding benefit concerts and marching on the state capitol, carrying banners. They were what I had faith in. I always felt like, in some way or another, if I didn't die in there first, that something somehow was going to turn out okay. That somehow I was going to come out the other side of that situation. But I didn't think it was going to be the legal system that was helping me in any way. I had seen that it was corrupt to the core. You know, people in America seem to have these ideas that judges and attorney generals and prosecutors, that they all have these jobs because they're somehow moral people who are looking out for society. In actuality, they're politicians. Their priority is the next election. These people knew that if they admitted that not only had they sentenced an innocent person to death, but allowed a child murderer to walk the streets for almost 20 years, they knew they weren't going to win that next election. They knew that if they had to pay me, Jason, and Jessie, if they had to come out and admit that they were wrong and compensate us in some sort of way, they knew they weren't going to win the next election. And that was their number one priority. And I think it was seeing things like that that made me lose faith very, very early.
Hi, I was just wondering what your relationship is with Jason and Jessie right now and what their statuses are today too as well.
Jason, immediately, whenever we got out, we went to Seattle. And Jason loved it so much he decided that's where he wanted to live, that's where he wanted to stay. He recently got his associate's degree, and what he wants to do is go on to law school. He says he wants to be able to help people who are in the same situation that we were in, which to me is a nightmare. You know, the last thing I want to see in my life is another legal brief. But that's sort of what he's given his life to. He's doing pretty well. He's married now. Jessie, on the other hand, is not doing well at all. You know, this is a kid that only had an IQ of somewhere between 68 and 70 to begin with. Then you dump all of this trauma and everything else on top of that. And they've made certain he will never live anything even remotely resembling a normal life. He's still in Arkansas. He went right back to the exact same trailer park he lived in when he was arrested. He doesn't know anything outside of that, so he's scared. He's scared to go anywhere, scared to do anything. But at the same time, he's scared that they're going to find some way to put him back in prison, so he has severed all contact with the outside world. He doesn't even have so much as a phone. The last I heard, he is living in a trailer with his father, who is very near death.
I was just curious about the role your family played during all this, because obviously your wife was like a big support, and you had a bunch of support in the nation and worldwide. But like, were your, parents or sister, anyone? What role did they play?
None. No, really, my father left when I was about 7 years old, and I never saw him again until I was about 17. I think I saw him for a couple of months, and then he was gone again, so I never even really knew him. When I was born, my mother was 15 years old. My father was 16 years old. They obviously couldn't raise a kid themselves, so they gave me to my grandmother. For all intents and purposes, my grandmother was my mother. She was the family figure in my life. And she died while I was in jail waiting to go to trial. When she died, it was like My family died. Everybody I had in the world died when she died. My sister, I saw her I think twice in 18 years, and if you put both times together, it may equal an hour. I never was really close with them, with my biological family. You know, it goes back to what I was saying a while ago about the relationships that we formed with people over the years that were sort of compensation. You know, people that became more family to me than people I was related to by blood. So, you know, in some ways, you know, I lost a sister, but I made up for it by gaining Johnny Depp. So I guess it, you know, in that regard, it kind of all worked out in the end.
Thank you.
Hi. So I have sort of like a compliment and a question. First of all, so your story is really disempowering in a lot of ways, but I got the experience of being a teaching assistant for sociology, law, and justice here. And we watched Paradise Lost in the class, and I see a lot of my students here, so that sort of speaks to how compelling the story is. And so I think that that's really empowering because it shows what an amazing educational tool that is for how sort of the injustices of the criminal justice system. So I guess I have to thank you guys for being a part of that in sort of a really unfortunate way. But also, I'm curious, in West of Memphis, I was really interested in how you and, what was it, John Mark Byers, is that his name? I thought it was really interesting how you guys sort of reconciled somewhere, and I wanted to know if you were able to or wanted to contact any of the other family members of the victims and what that was like if you did, or if you even felt like it.
We have actually. When the documentary first came out, we went on a tour with it where we would go around, and after the audience would watch the movie, we would do question and answer sessions afterwards, you know, answer anything they wanted to talk about that may have been left open-ended in the movie. And 2 out of 3 of the victims' families went with us. So we actually had dinner together several nights. One night, one of the victims' families, his mother, his sister, and his aunt actually gave me a box, and when I opened it, there was a pocket watch inside, a black pocket watch, and they had engraved the words on it, "Time begins now," and it had the date that I was released from prison. So 2 out of 3 of the victims' families actually became very, very vocal proponents on our behalf, doing everything they could to get the case reopened, to see that the right person went to prison. You know, as far as it being disempowering, that's sort of the opposite of what we always want to do. You know, this is a very dark story in a lot of ways. And it does have the potential to make you feel those things. But we don't ever want people to walk out thinking, you know, God, life is messed up. There's nothing we can do. We want to sort of present the exact opposite of that. You know, one of the things that I learned when I was in prison, when I was doing all that reading, I came across this thing about how scientists at one point had proved that it was impossible for a human being to run a mile in less than 4 minutes. They took into account all these things like maximum lung capacity and gravitational pull and length of the human leg, and all these sorts of things, and they said it is physically impossible for a human being to ever run a mile in less than 4 minutes. And then one day a man did it. And as soon as he did it and other people saw that it was possible, they started doing it too. And then now on a daily basis you have professional athletes that do something that science tells us is physically impossible for them to be doing. That's what we want to make people see. That's what we want to leave people with. That sometimes you're facing obstacles that look like they are impossible. But that's okay, because if you want it bad enough, you can do the impossible. We want to leave people empowered, not disempowered.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm wondering, at 18 years old, just a young kid, sitting there in the trial, what were you thinking was going to happen, and how were you feeling in that moment during the trial?
You're raised in our society with this idea of innocent until proven guilty. You know, you've seen it in all the TV shows and in all the movies and the Perry Mason episodes. So part of you is thinking, somehow, some way, this is going to turn out okay. Part of it's just being naive. But, you know, at that age, you're also thinking, innocent until proven guilty means they have to prove you've done something. And it should be impossible for them to prove you've done something you haven't done. It just doesn't make sense. So part of you, all the way up until the very end, is thinking, somehow, some way, this is going to work out. Somehow this is going to be turned around. At the last minute, there's going to be some breakthrough when good wins, when evil loses. And you keep believing that to some degree all the way up until they sentence you to death. And then it gets a little harder to hold on to that. But that's what I was thinking. I was thinking somehow, some way, this is still going to turn out.
Hi, I was actually going into the death penalty. If you could give any advice to Michael Addison, the only man currently on death row in New Hampshire, what would you tell him?
I guess just that you have to keep putting one foot in front of the other. If you look too far ahead when you're in that situation, you're going to lose heart. You know, you can't. One of the things that Lorri and I learned is we always thought there would be a day whenever I would be out, whenever we would be together. But we didn't know when that was going to be. We didn't know how that was going to be. And if you focus too much on that, you're going to go insane. It drives you crazy. You have to just focus on today. I'm putting one foot in front of the other. That was actually the lines on my arm, the broken lines. That's what that means. It's from the I Ching. There's a hexagram in the I Ching called Wind Over Heaven. And the nickname of Wind Over Heaven is the taming power of the small. And what the taming power of the small means, what it signifies, is that whenever you're facing a huge obstacle, you don't focus on the obstacle. Instead, you just focus on putting one foot in front of the other. And if you keep doing that long enough, that's eventually what will bring you out the other side. So that's all I could tell him to do. It's just focus on today. Keep moving. Keep getting through today. You know, if somebody tells you that you're going to be sitting in prison for the next 20 years, it's going to break you inside. You know, honestly, if they would have told me the day I walked into prison that I was going to be there 18 years later, I would have probably killed myself. All you can do is, you know, we don't have the strength, as human beings, we don't have the strength to hold up under pressure like that. To hold up under knowing you're going to be in prison for 20 more years. But what you do have the strength to hold up through, is the next minute. Just make it through this minute, and then through the next one after that, and the next one after that. That's all you can do.
Hi, Damien. In the first Paradise Lost film, we saw you holding your son, who was an infant at the time that you were convicted. So I was just wondering, without going into too many specifics, what's your relationship like now? Because you were in prison for the majority of his life.
Virtually non-existent. You know, I missed, my son is now 20 years old. I missed he'll be 21 this year. I missed every single Christmas, every single birthday, every single Thanksgiving. He grew up, for the most part, you know, he was literally an infant when I went to prison. just a few months old. So he grew up, for the most part, knowing someone else as his father. He doesn't know me. I'm a stranger to him. I don't know him. And there are no manual for situations like this. You know, there's no idiot's guide to raising your kids once you're out of prison. So it's one of those things that I hope there's some sort of way to salvage something out of it, to have some sort of relationship, even though it's obviously impossible that it's ever going to be, I shouldn't say impossible, but it's obviously not going to be a traditional father-son relationship. I'd like to think somehow, some way that we will be able to salvage something out of it.
Hi, so I just wanted to thank you so much for coming. Your story is really empowering. I think that the tragedy and just like everything that you faced, and I mean, it's horrible what you had to put up with basically when you weren't at fault. And clearly coming out of prison and, you know, making the documentaries and writing the book, it's kind of created a career for you and your wife as well. Do you see yourself in the future settling down, and do you have any aspirational goals, or, I mean, what are you planning to do after, what's your next step basically?
I don't think I ever want to settle down. To me, that sounds like nightmare. I don't ever want to see the day when I'm driving a minivan and living in the suburbs. You know, this isn't fun, you know, having to talk about this stuff over and over. But at the same time, it's like I was saying a while ago, we keep in mind that every single person who hears this, that it's making a difference in some sort of way. But I do look forward to the day whenever people don't hear my name and automatically say, oh yeah, that was that guy that was in prison, or that was that guy that was on death row. What I want to do eventually is I want to have my own art gallery. I want to be able to show people the things I love that have made a difference in my life in some sort of way. Whatever art form it is right now, that's photography. But also be able to seek out other artists that inspire me in some way, that when I look at it, it makes a difference in the way I see the world, and I want to be able to take their stuff and bring it to the world to, you know, put a spotlight on them in some way. I have a friend in New York that's like a brother to me, and he's insisting that it has to be half art gallery and half tattoo parlor. Which, that's okay too. That's fine. But I think that's what it is for me. Lorri, what is it for you?
I think it's the same. It is as important as it is to tell the story, and what Damien was saying before about it not being about the tragedy of it, even though that's important too, but that's not the way we're living our lives. It's actually, this story is in many ways, there are so many blessings that came out of it. And one of those is, and I wanted to speak to your question too, because I remember once when I was struggling with the prison guards treating me horribly, my fear that Damien was going to be killed or hurt terribly while he was in prison, and he was mistreated so many times, and you really have to pick your battles when you're dealing with the prison system. But we were both sitting Zen meditation, which is a really great way to kind of find some peace. But I asked the Zen master, who was my teacher, how do you deal with this hatred? How do you deal with the anger? And he said, you have to build a strong core. And that was not what I wanted to hear, because I wanted something easy. And building a strong core is not easy. And it's taken a long time. But I guess the most important thing for me in this life is to inspire people to maybe push through fear. I want to do creative things in my life too. I want to go back to doing creative things. But I really feel that the most important thing is to find ways to, I don't know, maybe instill some of the things that we've learned, which really does come back to building a strong core or having some kind of a spiritual connection. I don't care what it is. If it's doing yoga, if it's sitting quiet for 5 minutes a day, if it's more traditional types of spirituality, I do think that that is the thing that's going to keep us connected as a community, as a nation, in the world. So I know that's a long-winded answer to the question, but I'm beginning to think that's the most important thing.
Lorri, I just want to say you're an amazing person, and honestly, if something like this ever happened to me, I would hope that there would be somebody out there that's as motivated and selfless as you to just pause your life for a person that was started off as a stranger. So that's amazing. But I'm wondering, Damien, you said you came from a background of poverty, and obviously, this 18 years that was taken from you, it was really hard. But where do you think you would be now had you never been convicted of these murders and sentenced to death row? Because obviously Lorri's a prominent person in your life, and you might not have met her. Sometimes they say blessings in disguise, and that's a really big stretch for what you went through. But the good that has come out of it is tremendous already. But at the same time, if you hadn't experienced that, where do you think you would be right now?
I actually don't think blessings in disguise is much of a stretch at all. There are a lot of things in my life that are blessings. When I look back over my life now, I see how almost every single thing that happened seemed to form this chain, one link after another, that led me to where I am right now. I get asked that a lot, where I think I would be if this wouldn't have happened. And, when I was a kid growing up in Arkansas, I used to look around at me, at the poverty and the illiteracy. I would think, there has got to be something better than this somewhere. There's got to be something more meaningful than this, something more magical than this. Something where people don't look like grandparents by the time they turn 30. So I would like to think that somehow, some way, I would have found my way out of there, that I would have found my way to somewhere else. But the real answer is, I have no idea. There's no possible way to tell. Maybe I would have fell into the same trap that my own parents did, and my grandparents, great-grandparents. So really, that's what it all comes down to, is I would like to think that I would have found my way out, but there's really just no way to tell.
So after this one question, we have time for one last final question.
Hi, Damien and Lorri. I'm Bob. Having followed your story for a really long time, it's so good to see you here. And thank you so much for telling your story, for being vulnerable with us toward a greater good. And I wonder if you would talk just a little bit more, you touched on, but a little bit more about what your Buddhist practice has meant to you during your time in prison, and then certainly during this transition time.
Actually, one of the things I realized, when you do Zen meditation, formally it's called Zazen, and you sit there for hours doing nothing but following your breath in and out of your body. Every time your mind wanders, you just gently bring it back to your breath and watch your breath go in and out, in and out. And what I realized is most Westerners are not going to do this. I was in a situation where I didn't really have much choice. I didn't have other alternatives. You know, I didn't have Angry Birds to keep me occupied. So I focused on things like that as a necessity. But what I did realize over time was when I was a child, very young, I fell in love with Hermetic esotericism, what people call magic now, spelled with a K, M-A-G-I-C-K. And what the K at the end means, that's a way of differentiating it from sleight of hand and illusion, you know, things like sawing women in half and pulling rabbits out of hats. With a K, it means it's a combination of Gnostic Christianity and esoteric Judaism and a lot of the energy circulation practices and Chinese Taoism. That's what I've always been in love with. And I think what the Zen did was help me to understand that even more. You know, the form of spirituality that forms the very basis of my own spiritual practice goes back to, in the 1800s, there was a group of people, they called themselves the Golden Dawn. And you had all sorts of just incredible minds that belonged to this organization, like the poet W.B. Yeats, the woman who did the artwork for what we recognize as the modern day tarot cards. All of these people belonged to this organization, and their motto was the aim of religion, but the method of science. What they wanted to do is take every tradition in the world, whether it's Christianity or Judaism or Taoism or Buddhism, Hinduism, whatever it is, they wanted to take the practices, the core practices of these traditions and strip away all the dogma and the belief and all the crap that accumulated around them. What they wanted to do is find out what works, how it works, why it works, and how they can make it work better. And that still, to this day, is the core of my spiritual practice. I actually have an office in Salem. I teach both in Salem and New York, where I teach people the same techniques that I had to practice while I was in prison. A lot of it, what it all comes down to is shaping your own reality, in a way. You know, it's been really, really watered down with this horrible Oprah Winfrey crap like The Secret. But think of it as, when most people think of reality, they think it's one thing. They think it's our bodies, they think it's our clothes, the cars we drive, the buildings we live in. But in actuality, reality is more like an onion. There are levels and layers to it. You know, for example, your thoughts. You can't show a thought to someone. You can't see how much it weighs, what it smells like. But we know it's there. Only a crazy person would tell you they don't think. So that layer of thought is a very ethereal aspect of reality. Then on the other end of the spectrum, you do have the concrete, most base form of reality, which is our bodies, our flesh and blood, the ground we walk on. Well, what they found is that in every culture in the world but ours, there's another level of reality in between those two. In between the ethereal aspect of thought and the concrete aspect, there's another level that there's a name for in every culture in the world except ours. You know, the Chinese call it qi, the Japanese call it ki, the Hebrews call it ruach, the Indians call it prana. They discovered that this isn't an abstract concept. This is literally, it acts to reality almost like blood acts to us, to our bodies. And they found it's possible to do all sorts of healing practices and things that I don't even usually talk about in public because people start to think, you are a Blake. But what I found is that when the more I practiced these techniques, the more I practiced really, for all intents and purposes, magic, the more I realized it wasn't just circumstance, that I never, ever had it fail me one single time. You know, one of the things Lorri and I did the last year that I was in prison, we said every single day, we're going to spend an hour a day pulling in as much of this, whatever name you want to put on it, chi, this energy. We're going to spend an hour a day pulling in as much of this as we can, and we're going to stamp it with the intent. May I be free from prison, home living happily with Lorri. May it come about in a way that brings harm to none and is for the good of all, and in no way let this reverse or bring upon us any curse. Within a year, I was out of prison, and it happened exactly like that. We didn't say, let me get a new trial. We didn't say, let me get found innocent. We didn't say, let the person who actually committed these murders be caught. We didn't say, make the state admit they made a mistake. We just said, may I be free from prison and home living happily with Lorri. And that's exactly what happened. We still, to this day, both of us, do that as much as we possibly can in our daily lives. We make that sort of the core focus of our existence. So it's a very, very long-winded, winding answer, but still, to this day, for both of us, our spiritual practice is the core of what gets us through a lot of stuff.
Hi there. I wanted to say thank you as well, like a lot of people who have asked questions before me. I think it's pretty incredible that you both are able to speak on some of what I imagine are probably the most painful experiences that you've been through. But I think you're very brave to do that and to help other people learn through that. But my question is, Damien, what are some of the most joyful experiences that you've had in the 2.5 years that you've been out, other than eating cake?
I guess the most joyful experiences I have are usually the ones that most people would think are the most mundane, but that aren't mundane at all to me. You know, like discovering new food. You know, before I went to prison, I had never in my life tasted guacamole. And when I got out, I thought, that just looks disgusting. It's a green clump. You know, I don't want any part of that. And then I tasted it, and I thought it was one of the greatest things I'd ever tasted in my life. You know, I thought, what have I been missing all this time? So I started eating it like every single day. And I would drag my best friend along with me every single day until it got to the point when he said, do you want to get lunch? And I would say, yeah, let's go get Mexican. And I could see like him doing everything he could to keep from retching, like gagging, like he could not take it one more day. It was just discovering things like that. Or, you know, before I got out, before I went to New York, being raised in the South, when I thought of things like New York, I thought of Woody Allen movies, which to me were, I thought, why in the hell would anyone with an IQ of more than 3 ever want to go to a place like that, to live that life? And then when I went there, it's nothing like that whatsoever. I fell absolutely head over heels in love with the city of New York. We used to do things like, it's like when you're there are worlds within worlds that people don't even know existed. You know, like Sleep No More, that was one. But another one, we had lived there for maybe 6 months whenever one day we were walking down our street, the street we lived on. And there was a door to go into a bar. And from the outside, it just looks like this tiny little grubby nothing place. But we went inside, and it opens up onto a dance floor. And people go there to dance the tango. When we went in, it was really, really dimly lit. And the music sounded like something that was playing on like a 1920s Victrola. Those little crank record players. And it sounded like something you would hear in France in the 1920s. For some reason, there was a painting on the wall of one of the Olsen twins. Never did figure out what the hell that was for. But you would see these people on this floor dancing the tango, and They moved with this perfect precision so that it almost looked like you were watching people sleepwalking. But at the same time, it was one of the sexiest things you've ever seen in your life. And these people are there at 3 o'clock in the morning on a Monday. Nowhere else in the world would you find things like that, would you see things like that. So that's what it is for me. That's where I get joy from, is finding things like that, exploring things like that, just looking for these new weird little